Hey guys, we're going to do the last video for the sarcomere structure, and what I want to first talk about is what are we looking at. So in the videos before, we've gone through the whole structure of the sarcomere itself. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on just this actin and this myosin. So we know that the actin is the thin filament and the myosin is the thick filament, but they each have structures that are going to help the muscle contract. Okay, so when you're thinking about putting all these notes together, we just keep zooming in, zooming in, zooming in, zooming in to the smallest level. And now we're at the smallest level of the myofilament, either the actin or the myosin. So take this sheet out. Wait, not that one. This sheet here that says structure of actin and structure of myosin, and we're going to draw these, probably 7 or 8 colors, maybe less, I'm not sure. And we're going to draw these, and then we're going to go through the 7 steps of muscle contraction, and then I'm hopefully going to give you a visual to where you can understand how does a muscle contract. Alright, so for the structure of actin, remember that actin is your thin filament, whereas myosin is your thick filament. For actin, I want you to take a color. And actin kind of looks like beads on a string to me. And so I'm going to draw, let me get myself situated here. I'm going to draw, give yourself a little bit of space, little beads. In one color. Okay, now all I have done is I'm zooming in on just the actin filament of the sarcomere right now. All of the actin in the sarcomere looks like this, but I'm just zooming in on just one little bitty section of it. Okay, on that actin filament, there are going to be areas where the myosin is going to bind, and ironically enough, it's called the myosin binding site. So, let me label it as the myosin binding site. Just the green circle. Now, if it looks like this, then that myosin binding site is exposed. And myosin could come in and bind to the actin and cause a muscle contraction. But it's not always exposed. It has to be covered up. And so it's going to be covered up by 2 things. The first thing that covers it up is a filament called tropomyosin. So I'm going to cover the myosin binding sites, the green circles, with this blue line. That blue line is called tropomyosin. On the tropomyosin, there's going to be another compound, and that is called troponin. Let me get a color that'll show up. Let's do red. And it's going to be on the actual tropomyosin, like so. And these 2 things together are going to form a troponin tropomyosin complex because they are together. So the troponin tropomyosin complex covers up the myosin binding sites on actin. Okay, that is just the structure of actin. Now we're going to draw the structure of myosin. So scroll down here. Okay, myosin, if you remember, is a thick filament. And so I'm just going to draw it as a thicker filament than the actin. on the actual myosin filament, there's going to be these little things, and in my mind I think they look like golf clubs. And those golf clubs have a head on them, and that's going to be called the myosin head. They look kind of like this. And they're on both sides of the myosin compound. If you go back to your picture of the sarcomere, you can see that this is the myosin filament, and you can see all of these myosin heads, the little golf clubs on the filament. And what's going to happen is those myosin heads are going to bind to the actin, and they're going to flex. And when they flex, it pulls the sarcomere in. Z disc to Z disc is going to move in, and these little heads are actually going to like walk down the actin filament and pull that sarcomere in to contract. Okay, so on the actual myosin head, I'm going to zoom in on one of these in particular. Okay, I'm just going to write zoom in on just a myosin head. And on that myosin head, there are two spots. One spot is going to bind with actin. Let's see if you can see that. One spot is going to be called the actin binding site. And one spot is going to be for ATP. And ATP is going to be your energy molecule for this whole process to happen. So this is your actin binding site, and this would be on every one of the heads. And this is your ATP binding site. Now there's a whole process that goes with the whole ATP becomes ADP, and then it gets phosphorylated and all of that. I leave all that out because it makes it even more confusing than it's about to be. So just know for your test purposes that the energy for this muscle contraction comes from ATP. Don't worry too much about it. Comes from the fact that ATP is dephosphorylated and all that. Okay, so if you watch a video on that or you see that somewhere, don't worry about that. I just want you to know that ATP is where the energy comes from. Okay, so we are going to now talk about the 7 steps of muscle contraction. And I'm going to talk about what happens to this troponin tropomyosin complex. What happens to these myosin binding sites? Where do actin and myosin come together? So it might be good to leave your picture beside your notes so you can look back and forth to figure out what is she talking about and where's that again. And then I'll go back through it one more time with some stuff that I made to hopefully, stuff like this, and I'm going to kind of act it out for you to hopefully help you understand the muscle contraction. So leave this page out, and I want you to go to the second page that says 7 steps of muscle contraction.